to thank Susan for the decorations and all the food, and her helpers, Kate and
You forgot my
Sharon.
name?
But our astrology princess is not here.
Yeah, she's not well.
Clarissa?
She's got a cold.
Okay. She gave excellent readings, so I personally benefit every time she gives me a reading. So, well, like I said, as long as they're here, let's do this. The theme from Home Office this month is freedom from fear and error thinking. And I do have to confess, when I read the title of the outline for today that they give us to kind of use or not, I wasn't sure if it was a typo or a Freudian slip. It said, the fruit of God and evil. Was that supposed to be good and evil? All through the thing, I think it was a Freudian slip. Well, maybe she did it on purpose, I don't know. It was submitted by Reverend Petra Weldes, who's co-spiritual director at CSL Dallas, which is where
Michael Gott is
Michael
Yes.
Gott is, the musical director.
extraordinaire.
Yeah. So anyway, we will go with the talk today, the fruit of good and evil. And Bud and I were talking about evil this morning. It came up at a work conversation yesterday, and he said, don't bother me with that crap. So, you know, Bud, it's hard to understand what he's getting at. No, very straightforward. So we can all pretty much agree on what our good means. But what about evil? I'm sure the first thing most of us recognize, I know Sharon's already thought it, what's the reverse of evil?
Live.
Live. I don't know how those things happen, but I'm sure it's not an accident. The reverse of evil is either live or live. Again, that's not a coincidence. Our English language was created, I'll say, divinely. So what is it we call evil? Well, not having much experience with evil, I had to look it up. And I looked it up in the New Thought Dictionary. If you have one, page 40. Evil, a term used to imply the opposite of good. Evil is not a thing in itself, but it is an absence of what is felt to be good or pleasing. As darkness is an absence of light, or death is an absence of life. The term is usually linked with the idea of negation or destruction, though these forces in themselves are not really bad. What appears to be destruction at times is only a vehicle for change. The term is entirely relative. What might seem evil to one man might be seen as good by another. Even the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto yourself. What if you're a sadomasochist? Don't do that to others. But even the New Thought Dictionary labels evil as a vehicle for change. So let's hold on to that thought through this talk. But where do we even get the concept of evil? Is that something we learned from religions? Or did we just interpret anything that didn't go our way as evil? In the Christian Holy Bible and the Jewish Torah as well, we have the creation story of the Garden of Eden. In the story of the Garden of Eden, we learn about the eating of the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And it's supposed to be the moment where consciousness of self-awareness was developed. That instant, when they ate from that tree, is when they became self-aware, conscious. Good and evil then represent the inevitable dualism we have pairs of opposites that are part of the manifest physical universe. And they're the only way self-awareness is achieved. Self-awareness is evidenced by the power to choose, hensing between two things, we'll say good and evil, or God and not God, spirit and not spirit, self and other. That's been labeled the fall from grace. But it wasn't a fall at all. It really was the natural progression of the development of self-awareness. Now we know where that label, the fall from grace, came from. It's from our Judeo-Christian heritage. It was St. Augustine who coupled the story of the fall with sin, connecting it to women and sexuality, and created this sense of fallen wrongness of the human condition from which we need to be redeemed. The sense of good out there and evil within completely corrupted both the Jewish and pagan fertility traditions and understanding of the original blessing that life actually is. If you want to learn more about that, Matthew Fox is a great resource. You can look that up. Our beloved Dr. Holmes, our founder, weighed in on this in The Hidden Power of the Bible. And now this is the longest quote I've ever included here. So, begin quote. This story, talking about the Garden of Eden, literally would be so ridiculous as to be positively absurd. Hence, it's necessary to look for a deeper meaning. The writer was trying to teach a cosmic lesson. He was attempting to teach the lesson of right and wrong. The Garden of Eden typifies life in its pure essence. Adam means man in general, generic man. Man exists in pure life and has all of its agencies at his command. This is the meaning of his being told to till the soil and enjoy the fruits of his labor, enjoying the fruits of good. Still quote, the tree of life is our real being, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil means the possibility of dual choice. That is, we can choose even that which is not for our best good. In the story, man is warned not to eat of the fruit of this tree, for it is destructive. Eve, the woman in this case, was made from a rib of Adam. This story suggests the dual nature of man as a psychological being. The woman is made from the man. This is still quote. She must have been in him, else she could not have been made out of him. And the story clearly states that she was taken from his being. I'm going to stop the quote and say, I'm going to challenge that in a minute. Back to quote. Adam and Eve are the potential in all of us. The serpent represents the life principle viewed from a material basis and beguiles us in this way. He says that evil is as real as good, that the devil has equal power with God, that negation equals positive goodness, and that the universe is dual in its nature. From the acceptance of this argument, we experience both good and evil. And should we come full-orbed into individuality without having learned the lesson of unity, we should live forever in a state of bondage. This is the meaning of God saying, he shall become as one of us and live forever. The eternal mind does not wish us to live forever in bondage, And that is what would happen unless we first learned the lesson of right and wrong. And so that part of us which can be fooled eats of the fruit of dual experience, and in so doing reveals its nakedness. The native state of man is one of purity, peace, and perfection. And it's only when we can compare these with impurity, distress. Oh, I think I read that wrong. The native state of man is one of purity, peace, and perfection. I don't think thought I said that wrong. And it's only when he can compare those with impurity, distress, and imperfection that he's revealed as naked. Emerson tells us that virtue does not know it's virtuous. It just knows itself. It is only when virtue tastes of impurities that it becomes naked and must hide from itself. The voice of God walking in the garden means the introspective and meditative part of us, which in its moment of pure intuition and reason sees the illusion of a life apart from good or God. Error is ever a coward before truth and cannot hide itself from reality, which sees through everything, encompasses all, and penetrates even the prison walls of the mind with its clear effulgence. The conversation between God and Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden represents the arguments that go on in our own minds when we try to realize the truth. These arguments are familiar to all and need not be enumerated. Finally, the last sentence, or two. The expulsion from the garden is a necessary and logical outcome of tasting of dual experience. If we believe in both good and evil, we must experience both. End quote. Now I know that was a lot, but it really explains it pretty well. So why did God create man and make him a free agent? Because that's what we are. We have free will. If God had created us in such a way that he compelled us to do things, to be anything, and it wasn't our choice, we wouldn't be individuals at all. We'd be automatons, like robots. Now I want to shift just a little, but it supports this. In the teachings of the Kabbalah, they teach that God needs man just as man needs God. In our teaching, we frequently say that our purpose here on earth at this time is to give God a good time. According to the Kabbalah, that's really true. It's only through man's free will that spirit gets to experience the unknown. If we didn't have free will, spirit would control every thought, every action, every belief. There'd be nothing unknown or unexpected taking place. If you were here for class yesterday with Randy and Rana told us that we are on a planet of free will as part of a grand experiment. Did I get that right? It's a grand experiment. The only way spirit can experience itself is to create this sense of separation. And it breaks us down into individualized expressions of itself. Without a sense of self and other, hence the nakedness in the story of the Garden of Eden, there is no self. We are an individualized, God-conscious life, a point in the infinite sea of life, and an intelligent, self-knowing point. We're the outcome of God's desire to express himself as individuality. In each of the various religions that I've studied, we learned that God creates through the use of an archetype. Once he's created an archetype, this becomes the blueprint for further creative expression. Now, not to boggle your mind, but the teaching is that everything that has ever been and will ever be was created at the beginning in the mind of God. Like the principles of telephone and flight. Those principles always existed. But until man developed enough to learn how to use them, they were worthless. There are so many principles that are already in existence that as man learns to use them, they will just naturally occur. And as we've seen throughout the world, once mankind is ready, mankind around the world gets the same idea. When the Wright brothers were flying on Kitty Hawk, people in Europe were doing the same thing. Another thing that Kabbalah says that we hear over and over in other religions is that as it is above, it is so below. We heard that yesterday. So it seems to me that this sense of duality is a reflection not of our sense of separation from spirit, but that we innately feel and recognize that we are dual beings, and that we're spirit at the same time as we are physical beings. That's our sense of duality. That's where it comes from. It's not from being fallen from grace. And in Kabbalah, I'll take it a step further. As it is above, so it is below. And as it is below, so it is above. Go back to that idea that God depends on man for expression. What we do here creates equally somewhere else. But I wanted to throw this thought in. As always, I could be completely wrong about this. But it seems like Dr. Holmes supports this when he wrote, when God produced an instrument, man, through which God could consciously act, this advent of choice and will enabled man to accomplish that which nature had not done. Specifically, our power, our energy, and our imagination is God individualized in us. And I just don't want to explain this is a lot of God, God, God. Those are his quotes. I like to use other words, spirit, the one, consciousness,
You're
divine
going
intelligence.
in and out.
Your mic is going in and out.
Okay. In Science of Mind, it teaches us the fundamental power that we have is the power to choose. Our ability to choose sets the law in motion, and thus we co-create. Without the power to choose and things to choose between, we would be the automatons that Holmes described. Knowing that is the whole point of the knowledge of good and evil. We see it really isn't a choice between a moral or ethical good and evil, but rather about the ability to choose to live one with spirit or to turn our backs on our spiritual reality and live by human capacity alone. And I've tried that. I didn't like it. I turned back towards spiritual choices. So this earth school is to educate the quality of our choices through the law of cause and effect. We learn that every choice has a consequence. And through the consequences, we discover what brings more joy, more life, more abundance, and wholeness, and what doesn't. We also learn well what brings less joy, less life, less abundance. And those are the things we label as evil. So there's a natural question. Why is all the suffering, sorrow, and pain, all this tragedy that accompanies man? Again, our imagination can answer that question in a somewhat plausible manner. There's no other way in which true individuality can evolve. We have to experience the consequences of our truth, of our choices. Now, everybody knows the Buddhists call that law, cause and effect, karma. It is not punishment. It's a great learning experience. But when we become free of karma, we call that samsara. That's when we've let go of any experience that could have been called evil. So we've shown that man's nature is the same as God's nature. We should have no intellectual difficulty in realizing that an infinite intelligence could not make an automatic individuality, and it explains why man on this road to self-discovering experiences sometimes horrible conditions. His suffering is not God ordained. It's because he creates his own experiences as he becomes individualized. The right and the power to make these decisions, good or bad, puts us in a very critical position. Now, we know we're not automatons. We have feelings, we have beliefs. We're not completely at the whim of circumstances. We're not guided solely by our instincts, or we wouldn't be here today. Each of you has chosen to expand your spiritual consciousness. You guys are the masters on this road. Each and every one of you, by choice, have expressed this. And you get to take the consequences of those choices. More joy, more life, more abundance. It all comes with the territory when you turn towards spiritual beliefs and thoughts. The power of choice man has is either the greatest blessing he's ever had or the greatest curse. It can lift you to the heights, but misunderstood, it can drag you to the depths. Man is free to choose anything which he wishes, but he has to accept the responsibility for those choices. Universal law applies. Now, from the field of psychology, we know that individual self-awareness develops in a child between 9 months and up to 3 years. That's when the child really differentiates itself from mom. It stops breastfeeding. Oh, now I can live on my own. It's when the child discovers that things are real and stay the same even if the child can't see them. Adults can leave the room. When they come back, they're still the same. In psychology, that's called object permanence, which teaches essential reality, which children practice constantly. If you ever put a kid, a little toddler, in a high chair with things on the tray, they practice, what's that called? Essential reality. Mom picks it up. Oh, it's still the same. Mom picks it up. Oh, it's still the same. Well, I'll throw it over there. Oh, it's still the same. That's a learning experience. That's how they learn that things are real. That's when they learn powerful words like, no, mine. In our culture, exasperated adults sometimes either barely tolerate that or they actively punish that. Can you imagine the confusion that causes a child? They develop a sense of unworthiness. Not even 2 years old, and we're teaching them the wrong lessons. I use that as an example because humanity as a whole has to go through the same developmental stage, learning that we ourselves, individualized from the whole. There is no other person on earth like each and every one of us. Billions of people, and we are all different from each other. And yet, we have a lot in common. So let's review what I learned from psychology. Remember we said the time in the child development when they discover things are real and stay the same, when they learn object permanence? Well, let me rephrase that for all of us. How does that actually fit when we say we create our own reality? And I've said that many times, and I want to go on the record right now and say I'm never going to say that again. I'm going to modify it. We create the perception of our own reality. What if we raised our children completely in this teaching? You'd have a beautiful soul like Megan. Pretty much, you've been raised in this teaching. Yeah. Would they know that they're real and they have the power to shape their reality? They'd have the power to create only good. They certainly would never hear that they were heirs to the legacy of the fall from grace. Had you ever heard that story? No. This myth of a fall from grace appears only in Christian teachings. It's not in Judaism. It's not in Islam. In fact, in the Torah, which is the Old Testament of the Bible, the first chapter of Genesis says, Yahweh created man and woman at the same time as equals. That's Genesis 1. By Genesis 2, it was completely changed. But before that, spirit was completely androgynous. Then man and woman were created at the same time. But by Genesis 2, it was reversed. God created man, and from him created woman, which leads to the whole story of the Garden of Eden scenario. So Ernest Holmes reminds us that it's our sense of separation that needs to be healed. Don't buy that fall from grace stuff. We're not actually separated. But without the sense that we're not separated, we can't actually discover the power or the consequences of our choices. Now, I think I said that wrong. It takes the sense of separation to experience the consequence of our choices. One of the ways we achieve samsara, which is freedom from karma, is to rise above it, to understand the power and the connection. And they call that enlightenment. And everybody in here is well on their path to doing that by your choices. So, I have a summary. We're released from the fear of evil, from our own sense of being fallen, when we realize that this is simply our individual and humanity's path to self-awareness and self-discovery. We choose this path. You volunteer for this path before you come in here. But we choose this path to experience the results of our own consciousness. So experiencing the consequences of evil acts is simply the result of the universal law, the law of karma, or whatever we call it. This lesson of creating our own good and our own evil invites us to self-awareness and a realization that choosing God, good, or the highest and best for all, always has a life-giving outcome, whereas choosing the opposite has an opposite outcome. This is the promise. Even humanity will grow up and experience itself. Now, Dr. Holmes goes on to say that Jesus completed the story by returning to the state of Eden, to the Father. And he was fully self-conscious and aware of his oneness, rather than unconsciously one like the child, or like Adam and Eve in the garden. And this too is what we all shall do. And so it is.
Namaste.